Hi everybody. I want to talk to you about what we're going to do for question 2 for chapter 10, and what we're going to focus on is Sigmund Freud and Carl Rogers, two of the psychologists the book talks about for this chapter. They're two very different guys with two very different views. Freud, you could say, was a pessimist. He believed, in fact in his writings he said that in all his experience with people, he never really saw very much that was good in them. So that tells you a lot about what he thought. And maybe more importantly, he did not believe that human beings really understood themselves consciously. He believed everything was in the unconscious. Most of why we do things and who we were was buried deep in our unconscious mind, and our conscious minds didn't really have much access to it, and we just kind of made things up to rationalize why we did what we did. And so that's why he developed psychoanalysis and dream interpretation and free association, all these things to try to get at what's in the unconscious, because the person couldn't access that information directly. Carl Rogers, on the other hand, had a whole different picture. His basic ground level assumption about people is that people are good, that human nature is good, and people will do well if only they're given kind of a healthy environment to do it in. His approach, and he believed that people could understand themselves, and their conscious selves had a lot of power and insight ultimately. So his approach to therapy was just kind of try to create a safe environment and be a good listener and kind of get out of their way and let people talk things through so they could solve their own problems and come up with their own solutions to their own issues. So those are two very different perspectives. So what I want you to write about is, which do you think is more accurate, Freud's view of human nature and consciousness or Carl Rogers' view? Now, there's something else I want you to consider when you're writing, but before I tell you about that, what I want you to do is hit the pause button at the bottom of the screen, and for just a minute think about just your initial idea. Which do you think is more accurate, Freud's view or Carl Rogers' view? And a lot of you may have your minds already made up on that a little bit already, but if you don't, hit that pause button and just take a second and kind of make your mind up, and then come on back and I'll explain the rest of this. Okay, if you're back, here's the second part of what I want you to write about. At the end of the chapter, they talk about the Rorschach test. The Rorschach test is what's called a projective test, and the idea of a projective test, in the case of, we'll use that for example, you put an ink blot, Herman Rorschach puts an ink blot up in front of somebody and says, tell me what that looks like. Well, the ink blot doesn't look like anything. It looks like an ink blot. But people project, that is projective test, project from inside themselves what they see onto this ink blot that really isn't anything. Excuse me. So, for example, one person might say, I see a butterfly, and that tells the person conducting the test, maybe a little bit about their personality. The next person says, I see blood and guts. That maybe tells you something a little different about what's going on inside that person. Same ink blots, two different interpretations. And so that's the idea of a projective test. Now, I'm not sure that I believe that the Rorschach test is the best personality test of all. But what I will say, though, is in a way you could say life is a projective test. In other words, when we formulate opinions and have responses and reactions to what's going on around us, a lot of times, or all the time actually, that tells us a lot about ourselves. And so when you listen to two people, I'm sure you can think about examples where you listen to two people talk about politics, and what they're saying tells you more about them than it really tells you about the political situation. Okay? So what I want you to write about, in addition to whether you think Freud or Rogers is more accurate about the human nature and consciousness, is what does your opinion that Freud or Rogers is more accurate tell us about you, and tell you about you? Okay, so I'm kind of using the Freud and Rogers distinction and your opinion about that as a projective test. Some of your opinions probably do tell us something accurate and good information that you can learn something from, but it also probably tells us something about who you are and what your personality is like, if that all follows. So please do that. In addition to what your opinion about Freud and Rogers, in fact, I think this is maybe even more important and interesting about what your opinion tells you about you. And maybe even, for the rest of this class, if you think about it, just notice, see if you can be a little more attentive and notice your responses and reactions to things just as you go through day-to-day life, your responses to people and events and things. It's a great way to learn about yourself. If you think less about what's my opinion about this and think more about what does my opinion tell me about me, regardless of what my opinion is, it's a fantastic way to get deeper insight into ourselves. So thanks everybody. I'm looking forward to reading your posts.